Did the ancient Israelites believe in a flat earth held up by pillars? What was Sheol, and was the sky solid? We will examine the cosmological ideas of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, in this video. We begin with the definition of cosmology. Generally defined, cosmology is the study of the origin and structure of the cosmos, universe, and how it functions. The term cosmology is composed of the Greek terms for world and study of. Closely related to this is the term cosmogony, which deals with the origin of the structured universe. In ancient times, these two ideas were often difficult to separate, which is why I use both ideas, cosmology and cosmogony, interchangeably in this video under the term cosmology. When we think of the cosmos today, we think of planets, moons, solar systems, galaxies, and so on. The ancients, they perceived the cosmos differently. Despite the limitations of their observations, that didn't stop them to draw certain conclusions about the cosmos. Their knowledge of the universe was based on observations that were in many ways similar to those of other pre-scientific peoples. Even though there are general similarities between them, the ancients didn't have a consistent description of the physical universe. This makes it very difficult to develop a picture of their cosmological ideas. And the situation is similar with Israel. It's difficult to ascribe a single worldview to the Israelites, as there are also differences among them. It's important to keep this in mind. In general, the people of the ancient Near East, including Israel, as we will see later, viewed the cosmos as consisting of three levels: the earth, sky, and the sea. This was a widespread division in the ancient Near East. The first was the earth. Unlike us today, the ancients didn't see the earth as a sphere, nor did they assume that the earth comprised such a large landmass as we know today. Instead, it was mostly seen as a flat disk. Examples of this are Egypt and Mesopotamia. Both saw the earth as a disk. Genesis confirms this. There's a Sumerian creation myth that describes the origins of humanity, civilization, and the global flood. The description of the creation work of the god Marduk uses the metaphor of a raft for the earth above the waters that originally covered the entire world. It states, Marduk tied together a raft on the surface of the waters. He created dirt and heaped it on the raft. Here, the metaphor of a raft is applied to the earth. The basic concept conveyed is the relationship between a raft and the water on which it floats, just like the earth. In Egypt, it was similar. The Egyptians imagined that the universe consisted of three plates with two spaces between them. In the middle was the plate of the earth. It looked like a bowl with a raised rim. The flat part of the bowl was the Nile Valley. The raised rim represented the mountains of the countries surrounding Egypt. A clear indication that the people of antiquity believed in a flat earth is, as John Walton says, the idea that when the sun sets in the west, it travels under the earth to rise again in the east. The language used to describe the movement of the sun is not purely figurative. John Hilber says, language of the sun descending on the western horizon and ascending in the east is not purely phenomenological. It was part of a complex schema that imagined the sun visiting the underworld at night. For example, a Mesopotamian hymn tells of the sun god who crosses the seas and enters the underworld, where the gods rejoice when he appears and shows his splendor in the depths. The second level of the cosmos was the sea. The ancients believed that the entire world was surrounded by a mass of water, above, below, and all around. The earth was created from a primordial sea, the so-called cosmic ocean. Whether it floated on water or was supported by pillars, they believed that the earth was surrounded by these cosmic waters. And these cosmic waters were the cause of chaos, which was often embodied by a large sea serpent. How could this disk remain on the cosmic waters without sinking? There was no consensus on this in the ancient Near East, but two widespread possibilities were: the earth was supported by pillars, and another was that the earth actually floated on these waters. In Mesopotamian sources, one analogy is particularly common. Just as houses, palaces, and temples needed foundations, the people of antiquity assumed that the created cosmos also needed a foundation to support it. Thus, the earth was probably supported by underground pillars. A metaphor for this was that mountains, which supported the sky, had their roots in the underworld. This is illustrated, for example, in a passage from the Epic of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh, the only mortal to survive the Great Flood and living at the edge of the earth, gives a similar description in his quest for eternal life. The flank of the mountain here extended into the underworld, symbolizing the pillars of the earth. The cosmic ocean and the pillars of the earth are most clearly seen on a boundary stone from the Kesser period. This stone, it shows a visual representation of a three-part cosmos. The three cornerstones are visible with the fourth on the back. The concept of an underworld was widespread in the ancient Near East. As the name implies, it was located beneath the surface of the earth. Kyle Greenwood further elaborates on the underworld. In some respects, it was a place of terror and dread. At other times, it was perceived as a place of peace where the trials of life were no more. In Egypt, it was simply the beginning of a new existence. In all cases, it was the inevitable destination of all living things. The people of Ugarit also believed in an underworld. The Semitic word for it meant earth or underworld. Joel Hem says in connection to Ugarit's underworld, "The few Ugaritic texts that describe the underworld depict it as a place of slime and mud with an entrance under two mountains." The third level of the cosmos was the heavens. The ancients didn't have just one view of the heavens. It could have one level, 3, or also 7. It could also be a massive dome or a tent. That ancient peoples believed in a solid sky is evidenced by the texts that speak of various levels of the heavens made up of varying types of stone. A good example of this are the Mesopotamians. They generally believed in a 6-level universe comprising 3 levels of heaven and 3 levels of earth. The upper heavens were considered the highest level. They were associated with the Babylonian deity. The middle heavens were inhabited by a group of 8 or 7 gods. They were associated with the color blue and the blue segalmud stone, which resembles lapis lazuli. Some texts suggest that the blue floor of the middle heavens could be seen from the earth below. The lower heavens consisted of hard, glassy, translucent jasper on which the stars were fixed. Ancient jasper was often translucent. This explains why the blue stone floor of the middle heaven could be seen from the earth's surface through the jasper floor of the lower heaven. On the other hand, there's no evidence that segalmud stone was translucent. It prevented humans from seeing into the houses of the gods in the middle and upper heavens. Above the solid sky or heavens, there was a supply of heavenly waters. The ancients knew that there was a connection between clouds and rain. The best known example of this is the Babylonian creation epic Enuma Elish. The god Marduk defeats the primordial chaos dragon named Tiamat. After killing it, Marduk uses parts of its body to create heaven and earth. Marduk cuts Tiamat in half. From the lower half, he creates the flat, solid earth. From the other half, he creates the sky and stretches it out like a tent. It's reported that Marduk then uses an apparently waterproof skin and sets up guards to prevent the water from escaping from Tiamat's upper part. Later, he builds a heavenly kingdom for the gods above it. Since the sky was solid, it also had to be held up by something. The people had different ideas about how this worked: pillars, mountains, chains, and so on. The Egyptians, for example, believed that mountains held up the sky. Kyle Greenwood says, "Since the firmament was a physical structure, it required a physical support system. In Egypt, it was either supported by pillars, staves, or scepters, or sat on top of the mountains at the extreme ends of the earth." Mountains were important to the ancients because, according to their beliefs, the gods usually met and ruled on local mountains. Cosmic rule and stability emanated from these sacred hills. Robin Perry goes into more detail about the mountain of the Canaanite god El. In Canaanite mythology, the chief god El lived atop the Mount of El in a tent. There, in some myths, the divine council of gods met to eat and drink and then, under the leadership of El, to make decisions about the running of the cosmos. It is from this mountain that the powerful divine decrees issue forth. This will become significant later when we come to Israel, for the Israelites also had similar ideas about Yahweh in relation to mountains. In the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, God didn't reveal a new cosmology. Rather, as John Walton says, the Old Testament is shaped by ancient cosmology. Yahweh did not reveal an alternative cosmic geography to Israel in the Old Testament. With no alternative presented and no refutation of the traditional ancient Near Eastern elements, it is no surprise that much of Israel's cosmic geography is at home in the ancient world rather than in the modern world. Similarly, the Israelites didn't receive a modern cosmology from God as we know today. Instead, they had a similar conception of the cosmos as their ancient neighbors. Ancient Israel shared many of the same assumptions as its neighbors regarding cosmic geography. This is evident in the Old Testament language of the cosmos, and it's unsurprising due to the geographical and temporal proximity of Israel to Mesopotamian and Egyptian traditions and even texts. However, this shared world picture has more to do with inhabiting the same cultural stream and less to do with any dependence on specific ancient Near Eastern traditions. And since the Israelites were culturally connected to their neighbors, it helps to examine the other cultures to better understand the context of the biblical authors. Despite this, it's important to note that the Bible does not develop its own cosmology. It does not prescribe its own. Nevertheless, the Hebrew Bible takes up commonly held views of the time as given, and from these, cosmologies can be derived. As in many cultures of the ancient Near East, the Hebrew Bible divides the universe into three parts: heaven, earth, and sea. Closely connected to the sea is the abyss, which can also include the underworld. This scheme is particularly clear in some passages of the Hebrew Bible. In the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, the week of creation is given as the reason for observing the Sabbath. Exodus 20:11 states, "For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." Exodus 20:11. The book of Proverbs also refers to this in the father's instructions to his son about how God created the cosmos in his wisdom. It says there, "The Lord by wisdom founded the earth, by understanding he established the heavens, by his knowledge the deeps broke open, and the clouds dropped down the dew." Proverbs 3:19-20. The first level was the earth. The Israelites didn't believe that the earth was a round sphere. Like their neighbors, they believed it was a round disk. In several places, the authors of the Old Testament speak of corners of the earth or ends of the earth. However, this probably doesn't refer to a physical description of the earth as having corners, but rather to compass directions. For example, the same expression also refers to compass directions in Mesopotamia. However, in some places in the Old Testament, the term end implies a geographical end of the earth at the horizon. John Wilber points out that even if ends of the earth is meant hyperbolically, it only makes sense because the earth has an end. This might only be making the rhetorical point that something is a long way away. However, this figure of speech is meaningful in this hyperbolic sense only because there's an ultimate geographical edge. Indeed, in Psalm 19:4, the extreme edges of the earth are not hyperbolic in the poet's mind, since God's word extends to the most literal geographical extent, a place where the sun appears and disappears. One of the clearest references to a flat earth is found in the book of Daniel. The Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar tells Daniel about his dream. "The visions of my head as I lay in bed were these. I saw, and behold, a tree in the midst of the earth, and its height was great. The tree grew and became strong, and its top reached to heaven, and it was visible to the end of the whole earth." Daniel 4:10-11. Ben Stanhope sums it up aptly. He says, "Because the ancients believed the earth was a disk, Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel assume that if an object of sufficient size were stationed at the center of the earth, its top reaching the firmament, then the whole population of the earth could see it. This conception would be impossible, and Nebuchadnezzar presumed the correct but bizarre idea that the earth is a sphere with people living parallel lives upside down in distant lands, prevented from falling off by some invisible force." But is the use of a dream to represent an Old Testament view of the cosmos a good source? Perhaps even more questionable is that we are relying on the dream of a Babylonian king. Just because the Bible describes different human perspectives doesn't mean that they are correct, does it? However, we should note that Daniel is not swayed by Nebuchadnezzar's views. He sees no reason to correct the king's misunderstanding of the shape of the earth. And secondly, the tree is not depicted here as universally visible because it appears in a dream. Rather, Nebuchadnezzar's dream reflects the commonly held belief at the time that the earth was flat. John Hilber sums it up well. He says, "The vision of a tree from which one can see the edges of the earth is sensible given an incidental assumption that the earth is flat. This language is pure metaphor only for someone who is aware that the earth is spherical." It is sometimes argued that certain passages in the Hebrew Bible describe a spherical earth. Jacob Thiessen, for example, argues that the Bible sees the earth as a sphere and not a disk. According to Job 26:7, God hangs the earth over nothingness. The biblical worldview obviously assumes a globe floating freely in space. Isaiah 40:22 speaks of the circle of the earth. The noun chuk is used here, which appears 3 more times in the Old Testament, and which makes it clear that in Israel at the time of Isaiah, the earth was obviously imagined as a sphere and not as a disk. Like Thiessen, they usually use 2 passages for this. Let's look at both of them. The first is Isaiah 40:22. It is he who sits above the circle, the Hebrew word is here chuk, of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them like a tent to dwell in. Isaiah 40:22. It is often argued that the word for circle describes something spherical. The German scholar and fundamentalist Roger Levy does the same. He says, in the Bible, however, the spherical shape was attested even before the ancient Greeks. As early as 700 BC, the prophet Isaiah spoke of the earth as a globe. The ancient Hebrew word chuk used by Isaiah refers to a 3-dimensional circle in the Bible. In Job 22:14, it is used to describe the firmament. But this is far-fetched. First of all, we find linguistic evidence that testifies to the opposite. This evidence rules out the possibility that chuk refers to a spherical earth. For example, in Isaiah 44:13, another form of the word is used as a tool for drawing circles, namely a compass. The author describes how a craftsman makes an idol. It says there, the carpenter stretches a line, he marks it out with a pencil, he shapes it with planes and marks it with a compass. He shapes it into the figure of a man with the beauty of a man to dwell in a house. Isaiah 44:13. Here, a form of this Hebrew word is used to refer to a craftsman compass. It doesn't refer to a sphere. In Job 26:10 and Proverbs 8:27, the term from Isaiah 40:22 is used again to describe the circle of the earth that is inscribed, another reference to the 2-dimensional shape drawn with a compass. Kyle Greenwood aptly states, in the ancient world, as in the modern world, the compass is an instrument used for inscribing arcs and circles on a level surface and not for shaping balls. In fact, the author of Isaiah could have spoken of the earth as a sphere, but he chose not to. Robin Perry says, the prophet of Isaiah 40-55 could have spoken of the earth as a sphere had he wanted to. Another word, meaning ball, was available for use. But he didn't do so. Instead of a sphere, the circle in Isaiah 40:22 reflects the curvature of the horizon. The circle simply reflects the curvature of the horizon rather than a sphere. In the ancient world, the earth was consistently regarded as being circular. But in addition to the linguistic evidence, we also find more from the immediate context. Their arguments fail if we just read the verse to the end. It is he who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them like a tent to dwell in. Isaiah 40:22. Here, the author views the earth as a flat surface over which the heavenly tent is erected. This verse thus conveys the common ideas of the ancient Near East. The picture of the universe described here is the common cosmological view of the ancient Near East. The sky was a dome that arched over the disk of the earth, which sat on top of a primeval ocean. Under the ocean was the netherworld, virtually a mirror image of the space above the earth. Thus, the entire universe was an enormous sphere cut in the center by the earth. Another passage that is often used is Job 26:7. He stretches out the north over the void and hangs the earth on nothing. Job 26:7. Some modern interpreters who want to impose modern scientific views on this text understand this as an indication that the ancients believed that the earth floated in space. Robert Allen, for example, says, Job's assertion that the earth hangs on nothing is amazingly accurate and certainly counters the charge that the Bible's writers held that the earth stood on something else. But this again fails because of the context. Given that the author speaks elsewhere of God shaking the pillars of the earth and the heavens and building the earth on foundations, this view is very unconvincing. Kyle Greenwood says in relation to these passages, in light of the immediate context, it is clear that Job 26:7 articulates the extent of God's sovereignty, from the top of God's celestial Mount Saphon to the depths of Sheol, the land of nothingness. In context, Job 26 speaks of ancient cosmology. The term nothing probably describes the primeval waters. It is the vast trackless waste of primordial waters that is described as the nothing on which the earth sits. Evidence for this is that the word describing what the north is spread out is the same word that describes the watery cosmic chaos of Genesis 1-2. In Babylonian literature, Shamash is praised as the one who suspends from the heavens the circle of the land. This was part of ancient perception of the cosmos rather than a covert allusion to modern scientific understanding. Another indication that the Old Testament authors believed the earth to be flat is their language describing the movement of the sun. John Hilber shows this language is not only phenomenologically. Solar motion was part of the encyclopedic entry about the sun rising, moving across the sky, setting and traveling its circuit toward morning sunrise. Modern interpreters often dismiss this as merely phenomenological or operational use of language. The problem with this is that we moderns regard such language as phenomenological or operational, but the ancients did not. The motion of astral objects relative to the earth is part of an ancient schema of how objects in the real world relate and interact. The Israelites imagined the movement of the sun in a similar way like their neighbors did. Not necessarily as a personal actor, but as an object in motion. While the word sometimes used in the Old Testament for sunrise can also emphasize its radiant light, it's sometimes associated with words that express movement. For example, in Ecclesiastes 1:5, the sun travels a 24-hour circle, rising in the morning and setting in the evening. Or Deuteronomy, God's journey from the south is semantically parallel to his awakening. In both these cases, an assumption about the movement of the sun is associated with dawn. Other descriptions of sunrise even use a verb of movement. For example, Genesis 19:23, the sun rose over the earth, a verb that refers to movement. Or Psalm 19:5-6, the sun leaves its chamber just as a sound penetrates the earth. When the sun rises in the morning, it resembles a bridegroom leaving his chamber. When it moves across the earth during the day, it's like a hero joyfully running his course. In this psalm, the metaphor for God's omnipresent glory is meaningless without the concept of spreading movement. The author uses the same Hebrew words for both. God's glory, it extends over the whole earth. And the psalmist compares this spreading glory to the movement of the sun. The sun also moves across the earth during the day, only to set in the east. It's similar in Deuteronomy 16:6. In 33:2, the Hebrew word is applied to Yahweh. In 16:6, on the other hand, it is applied to the sun. It sets. Where did the sun disappear to after it set? Kyle Greenwood explains, since the sun and moon appear to trek across the sky in an arc only to hide during off hours, it was assumed that they disappeared beneath the earth. Other heavenly luminaries, such as planets and stars, enter through small pin-sized holes in a heavenly canopy. Similar ideas about the end of the earth can also be found in Mesopotamian literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh tells the story of King Gilgamesh, who decided to travel to the end of the world in search of a legendary man who had long ago been granted eternal life by the gods. The texts report that Gilgamesh found the immortal beyond the ocean as far as the sunrise reaches at the edge of the world. Gilgamesh traveled until he reached Mount Mashu, which guards the rising and setting of the sun every day, above which only the dome of the sky rises. After reaching these mountains that support the sky, Gilgamesh is confronted by two half-human, half-scorpion guardians who allow him to take the underground tunnel through the mountains that the sun takes at sunrise. The second level of the cosmos is the sea. As with Israel's neighbors, they believed that the land they called Earth was surrounded by water, above and below. The three-part stratification of the cosmos with the lower waters is found in the commandment against idolatry, which draws attention to the waters beneath the earth. It says there, "You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth." Exodus 24. These cosmic waters are under Yahweh's control. He controls not only the rainfall, but all waters, including those surrounding the cosmos. One of the most prominent themes in the Old Testament is God's deliverance of Israel through the crossing of the Red Sea when the people immigrated from Egyptian bondage. As is clear from these passages, God controlled the waters of the deep during their flight so that the Israelites could cross safely while the Egyptians drowned. The same was true of the flood. The flood narrative in Genesis 6-9 clearly expresses God's sovereignty over the cosmic seas. It says there, for example, "For behold, I will bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh, in which is the breath of life under heaven. Everything that is on the earth shall die." Genesis 6:17. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. Genesis 7:11. In reference to this, John Walton says, "In all of these texts, it is the cosmic waters of every sort that are involved in the flood. The act of creation had involved setting boundaries for the cosmic waters. In the flood, the restraints were removed, thus bringing destruction." In Genesis 6-7, God reverses the creation of Genesis 1. Before, God had separated the waters above from the waters below and the land from the sea. But now all the waters above and below flow into the land and bury it under a flood of cosmic waters. This disk of earth on the water also needed support. For example, he raises up the poor from the dust. He lifts the needy from the ash heap to make them sit with princes and inherit the seat of honor. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and on them he has set the world. 1 Samuel 2:8. Who shakes the earth out of its place and its pillars tremble. Job 9:6. Whereupon are the foundations thereof fastened, or who laid the cornerstone thereof? Job 38:6. John Hilber points out that even if the language of supporting pillars is metaphorical, the need to support the earth with pillars is related to the idea that there are cosmic waters beneath the earth. Like their neighbors, the ancient Israelites believed that beneath the disc-shaped earth lay the dwelling place of the dead, sometimes referred to as the depths of the earth. It was called Sheol. Both the righteous and the unrighteous dwell in Sheol. And as the name suggests, the underworld is located beneath the earth. People go down to Sheol when they die. This is illustrated, for example, by the Korahites' fall into the underworld through a crack that opened in the earth. And as soon as he had finished speaking all these words, the ground under them split apart, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them up with their households and all the people who belonged to Korah and all their goods. So they and all that belonged to them went down alive into Sheol, and the earth closed over them, and they perished from the midst of the assembly. Numbers 16:31-33. It's not speaking about an earthquake here. Rather, the earth opened up to the underworld, Sheol. John Hilber emphasizes, like Exodus 24:11 and 2 Kings 2:11, what is particularly important here is the narrative description of an experience that makes sense only if it corresponds to Israel's expectations about the structure of the physical universe. Another example is the spirit of Samuel that came up from the earth. The king said to her, "Do not be afraid, what do you see?" And the woman said to Saul, "I see a God, in Hebrew Elohim, coming up of the earth." 1 Samuel 28:13. The direction from which the spirit comes is repeated 5 times. It rises from the earth. And this makes perfect sense because the Israelites believed that the realm of the dead existed beneath the surface of the earth. Something similar also occurs in the Epic of Gilgamesh. In the source entitled Gilgamesh and the Underworld, Gilgamesh contacts his deceased friend through a hole in the ground from which Enkidu's spirit emerges. From the perspective of the earth, the sky consisted of everything above it, including birds, clouds, celestial bodies, and so on. The highest part of the sky belonged to the realm of the divine, while the lower parts of the sky belonged to everything else. As in the ancient Near East, the authors of the Hebrew Bible depicted the sky as a solid ceiling that also served as the floor of God's throne room. Above this sky was a collection of heavenly waters held by a firmament, a concept we will discuss in more detail shortly. 2 different but related metaphors were used to describe this ceiling. The first used images from tent life, and the other used images of a more physical structure. The Israelites referred to this ceiling in various ways. One was to draw parallels between the heavenly firmament and a tent. 2 good examples of this are Psalm 104 and Isaiah 40:22. Psalm 104 says that God spreads out the heavens like a tent. We have just looked at Isaiah 40 before. There God spreads out the heavens like a tent to dwell in. According to Kyle Greenwood, the heavens in Psalm 104 refer to God's dwelling place, which is located in the upper chambers. These chambers were above the waters, a reference to the upper heavenly waters held back by the firmament. In addition to the tent analogy, the Israelites used a metaphor similar to a dome structure. We see something similar in Enuma Elish. As we saw at the beginning, the god Marduk defeats the primordial chaos dragon named Tiamat. Then he uses the parts of its body to make the heavens and the earth. Here, Marduk cuts Tiamat in half. From the lower half, he creates the flat, solid earth. From the other half of her carcass, he creates the sky and stretches it out like a tent canopy. And then he apparently uses a waterproof skin and sets up guards to prevent the water from escaping from Tiamat's upper part. The Hebrew word most commonly used for this dome structure in the Old Testament is Raqia. This concept is particularly illustrated in Genesis 1, 6-8. And God said, "Let there be an expanse, Raqia, in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. And God made the expanse, Raqia, and separated the waters that were under the expanse, Raqia, from the waters that were above the expanse, Raqia. And it was so. And God called the expanse, Raqia, heaven. And there was evening and there was morning, the second day." Genesis 1, 6-8. The noun Raqia in the Genesis passage, translated here as expanse, refers to beating out, stamping out, or spreading out by hammering. It's often used in reference to metal. Based on linguistic data, the experienced linguist John Roberts concludes that Hebrew makes it clear that the biblical firmament, the Raqia, should be understood as a solid dome with a surface. Paul Celias explained in detail that Raqia was perceived by the Israelites, as by almost everyone else until modern times, as a solid dome. His conclusion is not based on an incorrect derivation of the meaning of the word. Rather, he compares how the noun is used in the Old Testament, taking into account the cultural background of the ancient Near East. With regard to how the heavens were understood historically, Celias says, "Only by taking Genesis 1 out of its historical context could one say that Raqia means merely an atmospheric expanse, or, as the more sophisticated conservatives say, just phenomenal language. In the ancient world, the sky was not just phenomenal. The ancients didn't just refer to the appearance of the sky as being solid. They concluded from the appearance that the sky really was solid, and they then employed this conclusion in their thinking about astronomy, geography, and natural science. The Raqia was for them a literal physical part of the universe, just as solid as the earth itself." In the 3rd century BC, according to legend, the Old Testament was translated by 70 Jewish scholars into a Greek Bible called the Septuagint. The Septuagint was important because it served as the primary Bible for the authors of the New Testament in the early church. Ben Stanhope says, "When these ancient Jewish scholars made this translation, they selected a very rare term for expressing the meaning of the word Raqia. They picked a Greek word which indisputably emphasizes firmness and solidity. The same is true of the Latin translation of the Vulgate. Again, Raqia was perceived as a solid object. And the early church saw it similarly. They speculated about whether the firmament consisted of earth, air, fire, or water. Origen called the firmament without doubt firm and solid. Ambrose, commenting on Genesis 1:6, said, "The specific solidity of this exterior firmament is meant." Augustine said the word firmament was used to indicate not that it is motionless, but that it's solid and that it constitutes an impassable boundary between the waters above and the waters below. The purpose of the firmament was to separate the primeval waters. This created the separate areas above the heavens and below the heavens. It thus served as a retaining barrier that prevented these upper waters from bursting forth and flooding the dry earth below. These primeval waters were located both above the firmament and below the earth. The windows of heaven were understood as the entry point for water from above. That's why the Old Testament often states that the absence of rainfall is due to God closing the heavens. For God controls the weather by either closing the heavens or opening its windows. There was a direct connection between rainfall and obedience to God. It's important to note that the Israelites didn't think that rain came from holes in the sky. They knew that rain came from clouds. Rather, the expression windows of heaven through which rain falls is a metaphor for clouds. In Genesis 1, the idea of heavenly waters is particularly evident in the contrast between the heavenly objects and the water. According to Genesis 1:17, God placed the heavenly bodies in the firmament. The contrast between the heavenly bodies and the waters is significant here. If one imagines it as two-dimensional, then the heavenly bodies are fixed to the surface of the Raqia. If one imagines it as a three-dimensional space above the Earth, then they move within the space of the Raqia's expanse. Both possibilities are difficult because God also placed the waters above the Raqia. This rules out the possibility that these waters are clouds. The clouds are located below the sun, moon and stars, as they block their view from an observer on Earth. However, verse 7 describes the waters as being above the place where the celestial bodies are fixed. This means that even if one were to doubt the meaning of Raqia as a solid dome, Genesis 1 clearly speaks in context of a body of water above the heavens. The idea of heavenly waters is also evident in the flood narrative. There it's reported that windows in the heavens were opened so that the water could flow onto the earth. These windows were closed again when God decided to end the flood. The necessity of such openings also points to the solidity of the heavens. This is also evident in other passages. The God of Israel is enthroned above the heavenly flood. Covering yourself with light as with a garment, stretching out the heavens like a tent. He lays the beams of his chambers on the waters. He makes the clouds his chariot. He rides on the wings of the wind. Psalm 104, 2-3. Jeremiah 10:13 says, when he utters his voice, there's a tumult of waters in the heavens, and he makes the mist rise from the ends of the earth. He makes lightning for the rain, and he brings forth the wind from his storehouses. Jeremiah 10:13. Robert Street summarizes the purpose of the firmament well. He says, the canopy arched from horizon to horizon and formed a dome or vault above the earth, which the ancient Hebrews regarded as being flat. The purpose of the dome was to keep the cosmic waters from overflowing and flooding the earth. The concept of a domed universe was common among the peoples of the ancient Near East. It's important to note that Genesis 1 is not primarily concerned with defining the nature of the firmament, but with describing the restoration of its function. Thus, the firmament not only served to hold back the heavenly waters, but also to regulate the climate. In a similar way, the expanse set up in day 2 is the regulator of climate. Climate originated from the heavens, and the expanse was seen as the mechanism that regulated moisture and sunlight. Another passage that suggests a solid sky is Job 22:12-14. In this text, Eliphaz accuses Job of doubting God's omniscience. Is not God high in the heavens? See the highest stars, how lofty they are. But you say, what does God know? Can he judge through the deep darkness? Thick clouds veil him so that he does not see, and he walks on the vault, a literally circle of heaven. Job 22:12-14. Also interesting in Genesis 1 is the comparison of the intensity and size of the sun and moon in relation to the stars. And God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. Genesis 1:16. John Hilber says, in what sense are sun and moon great? In the cognition of the ancients, these two objects are larger and more intense than stars, but we know this is not true absolutely. The same is true of birds. Like the heavenly bodies in the firmament, birds also appear to move on the surface from the perspective of an earthly observer flying around the lower edge of the expanse of heaven. Another indication that the sky was solid is that it was often associated with the color of stones. A similar idea can also be found in Mesopotamia. As we saw at the beginning of this video, the Mesopotamians believed in a 6-tiered universe comprising 3 levels of heaven and 3 levels of earth. It's interesting to note that the middle heavens were associated with the color blue and the blue sagamot stone. In addition, some texts suggest that the blue floor of the middle heavens could be seen from Earth. When they looked at the cloudless sky from below, it was blue. Therefore, they associated the sky with blue stone as its floor. Since the lower heaven was made of hard, translucent jasper, they could see through the jasper of the lower heaven and see the blue floor of the middle heaven. A related concept that we find in the Bible is that the firmament is visually comparable to a kind of blue stone. In Exodus 24, Moses, Aaron, and the elders of Israel ascend Mount Sinai. Verses 9-10 say, then Moses, Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel went up, and they saw the God of Israel. There was under his feet, as it were, a pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven for cleanness. Exodus 24, 9-10. Kyle Greenwood says, sapphire, of course, is a deep blue gemstone, the color of a cloudless sky. In fact, to illustrate the idea behind it, James Bruckner translates this phrase from Exodus 24 as clear as the deep blue sky. These physical properties of the firmament are only possible if the heavens were considered a solid surface. It's similar in Ezekiel 1. There the Raqia is described as crystalline or ice-like in color. In a vision, Ezekiel sees God sitting on a throne above the firmament, carried by cherubim whose 4 faces represent the cardinal directions of the Babylonian compass. The message of the vision is that God's reign extends over the whole earth, even though the Jews are in exile in Babylon. As Ben Stanhope says, we know that this passage describes a representation of heaven because Raqia appears 17 times as a noun in the Bible. In all other cases, it refers to heaven. Other Jewish texts provide further support for this interpretation. For example, the apocalyptic text called 3rd Baruch tells us about the Tower of Babel and how its builders tried to ascend to heaven. They wanted to find out what heaven was made of. In another source, the Babylonian Talmud, the rabbis tell us that the man of Babel said, "Let us build a tower, ascend to heaven, and cleave it with axes, that its waters might gush forth." Since the sky was solid, it also had to be held up by something. As we have already seen, ancients had different ideas about how this worked. Pillars, mountains, and so on. John Walton says, consequently, when the Old Testament refers to the pillars of heaven, even though in poetry, we have no reason to believe that for them it was only figurative. In various places in the Old Testament, mountains are depicted as foundations, pillars that support the heavenly dome. Keel points out that in the parallel passage to 2 Samuel 22:8, in Psalm 18:7, the expression "foundations of heaven" is replaced by "foundations of the mountains" because both are identical. William Brown elaborates on the usefulness of mountains as supports. He says, "The mountains serve as weight-bearing pillars that hold aloft the heavens, preventing cosmic collapse. God sets the cosmic infrastructures and boundaries firmly in place, all to maintain the world's stability." In the Minor Prophets, the roots of the mountains also reached into the underworld, thus forming a solid foundation for both the earth and the firmament. Above the heavenly waters was where Yahweh dwelt. This is explicitly stated in Deuteronomy 26:15, where the word for dwelling place emphasizes its remoteness. "Look down from your holy habitation, from heaven, and bless your people Israel and the ground that you have given us, as you swore to our fathers, a land flowing with milk and honey." Deuteronomy 26:15. The ladder in Jacob's dream stretched from earth to heaven so that God's angels could move between the two. And he dreamed, and behold, there was a ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. Genesis 28:12. Similarly, several psalms locate God's throne in heaven. Particularly striking is the contrast made in several of them between people on earth and God in heaven. This is also evident in the story of Babel, where God comes down from heaven to earth. "And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of man had built. Come, let us go down, and there confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech." Genesis 11:5 and 7. In many ancient cultures, mountains were the places where the gods met, ruled, and made decisions. It was similar in ancient Israel. They also had similar ideas about Yahweh in relation to certain mountains. The prophets tended to emphasize the importance of Mount Zion, the temple, and the city of Jerusalem in relation to Yahweh's plans and intentions. That's evident in several places. For example, Isaiah 2, Micah 4, and Zechariah 14. It's therefore not surprising that the Old Testament sometimes describes Mount Zion and the city of Jerusalem as the navel of the earth. The Israelites were not alone in this. Other cultures of the ancient Near East, such as Babylon, Assyria, Egypt, and Greece, also created important religious cities with the center of their nations. And that brings us to the end. I hope this video has helped you to gain some insight into the cosmological ideas of the Old Testament. Feel free to follow me on Instagram, and see you in the next video.